do you go by Eric Fried?
Never.
Or never? It's Eric Corey Fried?
Here's why.
Okay.
When I was in elementary school, there was a buddy of mine in class who was named Eric Reed. And our teacher, we would mess with the teacher all the time. And so she started using our middle names. And he was Eric Scott Reed. By the way, he's a famous pianist, if you're into jazz. But we grew up together, and we were always using our middle names. And so it just kind of stuck. And then every city I've ever lived in, there's always been, I don't know, 5 or 10 Eric Frieds in the phone book, and that always bothered me.
So it would mean that you were an individual then.
Yes, it's what I found is that also that something about the number of consonants helps people remember me.
Yes, it's very memorable. It has a nice ring to it. Eric Corey Fried.
It's got like a flow to it. And my friends tease me about it all the time, but it's part of making people remember me, and that's isn't that what we all want?
Yes,
Just to be remembered.
And if we can't do it here, we want a stone on the ground or something like that.
Exactly.
Welcome. This is Craig Applegath, and this is the 21st Century Imperative Podcast, the podcast series that explores the insights and approaches of scientists, designers, planners, engineers, business entrepreneurs, and other successful change makers who are finding effective ways to meet the 3 critical challenges posed by the 21st century imperative. These are: how will we continue to live on our planet without destroying our biosphere? How will we repair and regenerate the environmental damage we have already caused? And how will we adapt to the escalating impacts of climate change? Each episode will feature an interview with an individual whom I think you will find not only inspiring, but also very relevant, helping you answer the question, what can I do to meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative? In this podcast, I have the pleasure and fun of interviewing Eric Corey Fried. Eric is one of America's best-known advocates for living architecture and is a passionate advocate for architecture that doesn't just reduce environmental harm, but actually improves the environment it's part of. Before meeting Eric, I'd seen him present at a couple of conferences and, of course, seen his 2 TEDx talks. But it wasn't until we were both presenting at the International Living Futures Institute conference in Portland this past April that I had a chance to get to know him. The first thing that strikes you about Eric when you meet him is the mischievous twinkle in his eye. And if you've ever seen him present, you know he is as much a stand-up comedian as a green building thought leader. In terms of his expertise in addressing the challenges of the 21st century imperative, his resume clearly paints a picture of someone who has spent their career dealing with its challenges in both his architectural practice and as an advocate of living buildings. Eric is an award-winning architect, author, and global speaker. His current role at Morrison Hershfield is Sustainability Disruptor, a role that has him identifying solutions to problems most teams didn't even know were holding them back. Before that, he was the founding principal of Organic Architect, a visionary design firm in biophilic and regenerative design. In addition to his architectural practice, Eric was vice president of the International Living Future Institute and chief community officer of Eco-Districts, both nonprofits pushing innovative new paradigms for deep green buildings and communities. Eric is the author of 11 books, including Green Building and Remodeling for Dummies. In 2012, he was named one of the 25 best green architecture firms in the U.S. and one of the top 10 most influential green architects. And he also holds the prestigious Lead Fellow Award from the U.S. Green Building Council. I think you'll enjoy our conversation. So Eric, great to have you as a guest on 21st Century Imperative Podcast. One of the things that struck me when I first saw your TED Talks was how effectively you use humor to get your audience to think about the hugely difficult environmental challenges we face. So my favorite bit, I think, was when you proposed renaming climate change chlamydia, because no one likes that. Have you always been a comedian? Were you the class clown as a kid?
No. I was in a class with a bunch of clowny people, and I don't think I stood out any more than any of them. I think what happened was when I when we all discovered girls. I think that's when humor started. So maybe that was in ninth grade or something like that. When let's see, I'm not a baseball player. I'm not a football player, but I can think quickly on my feet and make a girl laugh. And
that's why a lot of comedians started.
Yeah, maybe she'll laugh enough that she'll not realize those other things and go out with me.
Did it work?
It worked on my wife. So,
yeah.
It worked. And then I started hanging out with a lot of comedians. That was the problem, because comedians are weird. They're weird people.
And they have, and when you read their bios, they have tragic lives. You don't seem to have had a tragic life part of comedian.
They don't know.
At least not that your bio says.
They don't have tragic lives as much as they're trying to live in the present moment. And so what happens is we get around each other and we just start teasing each other. And so that was really part of it, was that my friends and I, and this is now years later, when we were in San Francisco, we'd put on a monthly party in San Francisco, and it essentially became a roast where we tease each other and just tear each other apart. And there's no decency in any of it. But I felt like I had these two parts of my personality. I had the serious professor of architecture who was giving you a lecture on sustainable design, and sustainable design is dire and it's serious, and we must take these things seriously. And then I had the guy that was roasting his friends in a nightclub. And I didn't like having those two parts of my personality separated. And I could see it in the audience faces. I'd give a normal talk and they'd be bored and they'd be, checking their phone or, not paying attention. And so one day, I don't remember what happened, but one day I was tired and I just started ad-libbing, just improvising instead of sticking to the slides. I'm like, you guys aren't even listening to this anyway. Listen, here's the problem. And I just saw the reaction. I saw them perk up. I saw their body language. I mean, they're all facing you, so you can see it. And so my advice to anybody, if you want to get into public speaking, the best thing you can do is just read the room. Just look at the audience. And if you're droning on about something that you think is so important and they're not paying attention, you're failing.
Humor is key.
Yeah. So it was really a very architectural idea of, what am I here to do? I'm here to impart a message. And if they're not listening, let me change how I deliver that message.
Because on both the TED Talks I've seen you give, plus in your presentations, humor is a key part of how you connect to people, but also give them sort of the narrative transport to carry the ideas away. Like, who's going to forget chlamydia? I was telling someone that today.
Nobody wants to catch that.
No one gets that, right? And to connect that to climate change is wonderful. But a little more seriously, tell us a little bit more about your passion for solving environmental problems and through what you're doing now is biological living architecture. Where'd that passion come from? How'd you get there?
That's a good question. I think I'm a very unlikely person to end up being green. And I don't know, when you went to architecture school, I don't know if this was the case, but when I went to architecture school in Philadelphia, we all had nicknames for each other. We never called anybody by their real name. So we all had nicknames. And so there was Deconstructivist Boy and there was Postmodern Guy.
What were you?
I was Nature Boy.
And why?
Because all my buildings had like green growy things and they were all oriented to the sun. And so that was my nickname in college. And any of my college friends will tell you that. But I'm not a nature guy. I hate camping. I hate being outdoors. I like architecture. I like being in buildings, oddly enough. For me, sustainability was not a feel-good, kumbaya, get back to the earth thing. For me, it is illogical to destroy habitat. It is illogical to use a resource until it's depleted. It is illogical to pollute the waterways and the airways that we survive on. It just doesn't make any sense. And so I came from sustainability-wise, I came from that perspective. And then in addition to that, my early mentors were old Frank Lloyd Wright students. So old Taliesin apprentices, essentially.
And their background is in the Frank Lloyd Wright organic architecture.
Right. So starting at age 8.
Which isn't really organic per se, but it was arts and crafts, but tended to use wood and connect with nature through views and so forth.
Yeah, I think if anything, organic better describes his process than anything else. That was my early inspiration, was this idea of organic architecture and connecting to something bigger than yourself and connecting to nature and living in harmony with nature in a much more logical way. And it took me it's funny. It took me basically 45 years to get to this point of being able to explain this clearly. But when I was in school, it was torture. I was frustrated and depressed and feeling very, nobody
like you didn't fit in.
No, I didn't fit in at all. Nobody was talking about this. My professors were telling me, Frank Lloyd Wright's gone. It was the 80s. So at that point, nobody wanted to hear.
Postmodernism was in.
Yeah, nobody wanted to hear about Frank Lloyd Wright. So I felt very, very much the outcast, and really suffering with it. And it was at a low that I was in the library of the architecture building, and there was no internet. There was no internet back then. So I was in the library, which we used to have, and I'm flipping through a magazine, and I saw the work of an architect named Bart Prince, and immediately it was like, whoa! If Frank Lloyd Wright had stayed another 50 years living, this is the kind of stuff he might be doing. That was my first thought. And sure enough, Bart Prince worked for Bruce Goff, who worked for Frank Lloyd Wright.
Right.
So I went to the phone book section of the library. Remember those? And
that's right.
I pulled out the Albuquerque phone book, and I flipped through, and there's his name and his address, and I write it down because again, there's no internet. And I wrote him a letter, and in the letter was not about, oh God, I love your work. It was, I'm miserable. My professors don't friggin' understand me. The students think I'm nuts. I'm putting green growies on the building and oriented in the sun. It all seems very logical to me, but they're telling me I'm crazy. And I've been doing this since I was 8 years old. Help! It was a cry for help.
And what happened?
The most miraculous thing. He wrote me back, and he had been through something similar in his life. He had felt the same way. Keep fighting, keep going. You're on the right path. And then he included in it a newsletter from a group of all the old Frank Lloyd Wright and Bruce Goff apprentices. They're all part of a club. And so he included a newsletter in it. And he's like, maybe you want to join this group. And so overnight, I went from feeling utterly and completely alone, like I was the weirdo.
To part of a tribe.
To suddenly there's this whole tribe of people that were very willing to mentor me and had amazing stories about
them feeling the same way, no doubt.
Yeah, and probably, and having sat at the hem of the skirt of one of the greatest architects of all time, So it was very empowering and came at the perfect time, because otherwise I probably would have become a sculptor.
So who most inspires you now?
Well, you do, Craig.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, other than myself.
Now?
Now.
A lot of
not necessarily architects, but who in the world out there gives you inspiration, keep driving you forward and doing living architecture?
There's so many people doing amazing things now, and so I follow on Instagram. I follow all these people just to try to keep up with them. On the architecture side, God, I don't know if I should just single out names or I'll forget something.
Well, I'll tell you, even if it's one of many, people listening might be interested to go and check them out.
So I'm fascinated with what Blark Ingalls is doing. I'm fascinated with what Calatrava is doing. I'm even fascinated with what Frank Gehry's doing, even though I fundamentally disagree with his approach. And told him that at a AIA thing in LA once, and he handled it very well. But I think the thing is, I like to go to buildings and look at them and feel something, and I like to go to buildings and learn. And I'm seeing people now that are building things that I thought were unbuildable. I'm seeing people put together assemblies of things, and I'm like, God, how do they do that? I'm also obsessed with prefabricated building materials, 3D printing, contour crafting, CNC milling, and I've been deploying those in some way, in small scale, large scale, as much as I can. But because most of my work is consulting to other people about their buildings, I almost feel like that part of my personality, artist as architect, is almost on hold, and I just do that as a hobby.
Or being transmuted through others.
Yeah, a little bit.
So before we get too far into the interview, maybe you could provide listeners with a working definition of what constitutes living architecture, because you're sort of the key embodiment of that idea right now in the world.
It's funny because the more you think about it, and over the years, the simpler my definition has become. It used to take me probably 5 minutes to explain it, and now I can explain it in a line. Living architecture, quite simply, is where the building takes responsibility for itself and its impact on the planet. That's the simplest way I can explain it. That doesn't hem you in. And responsibility is a great word because it implies that the developer or the client has a responsibility, the contractor has a responsibility, the architects, the engineers, we have responsibility. And just because it's not talked about or typical doesn't mean that responsibility, that ethical responsibility, doesn't matter. One of my old mentors was a man named Malcolm Wells, he was the father of underground building. And he is, by the way, buy all of his books if you can. He passed away a few years ago, but the books were gorgeous. But Mac is what we all called him. Mac had this idea that if we were to scrape a site and put a building down, that we had a duty to restore the nature that we've destroyed and put it on top. So that's how he came up with this idea of underground building. Basically green roofs for everybody.
So living architecture, although it may have living things in it on it, in itself isn't about the architecture living necessarily. It's about it being part of a bigger system. Although you do talk about how architecture could be alive and biological in nature too.
Yeah, I had an experience over these last 2 years that really changed how I think about creativity and problem solving because of the X Prize Foundation. And so they essentially hired me to develop an X Prize for healthy buildings. It was a beautiful question. They said, okay, we're going to give you some money and some research staff, and you're going to tell us what buildings need to be in order to be truly healthy. And we're not going to tell you what it is. You can do whatever you want. Just and they led me through this process through what's called Singularity University. And it lets you look at problems and solutions in a very different way. That totally changed me. It rewired my brain.
How so? Like what were the key things that changed you? Like before and after Eric Corey Fried.
Eric's fine. One of the things that we discussed at length was the idea of bias and how all of us as artists and architects and problem solvers and scientists too, we come to everything with a certain bias, whether it's a preference for ways something looks or the way something should look or should be. And we bring those biases to us with our solutions. And so we had to almost go through a breakdown of our internal biases and mapping of our biases to make sure that we weren't coming to this with any preconceived notions. And I had a lot of them and still do.
Or at least know what they are.
Yeah. And I think the hardest part for any artist would be to be honest with yourself about it. But just that alone, going through the process of looking at biases was fascinating. And then the next part was, if you're going to invent a solution to a problem, you need to understand the problem. And so we analyzed the problem more so than I've ever looked at a problem before, and in very unusual ways, in terms of the stakeholders, the beneficiaries, and then there are embedded problems where there are a lot of people that like the way they work. Affordable housing, for example, is a good example of an embedded problem. Affordable housing developers make money doing it, so they like the way it works. But there's a whole mess of people that hate the way current affordable housing looks and functions and finances. So there are problems like that you need to look at in a new way. And then when you come to the solution, how can you take a solution and instead of it solving the problem for one person, how could you digitize it, democratize it, and essentially make it exponential? So instead of solving, one house for one person, you could essentially find a way to provide housing to 100,000 people. And so we go through that whole process of how can you do that. And so what I ended up with after a year was we came up with this idea that we could grow buildings. We could literally manipulate DNA and grow buildings. And all DNA really is a bunch of code.
Protein code.
Yeah, 4-letter protein code that biologists are already sharing with each other like MP3 files. And so you could essentially share growable designs in that way. And not only would that transform building, which would be amazing, but it would also help the biologists too. So, there are biologists right now trying to grow a liver. Right.
Yep. Taking stem cells and then culturing the right way to grow liver cells.
Exactly. Yep. Which will be great. It'll cure disease and do wonderful things. Well, they're having trouble. And so when I talk to these biologists at Stanford, MIT, and Harvard, I said, what's your holdup? And I'm not a biologist. I'm an idiot. You're a biologist. I'm not. But I tried to keep up. And they said, well, we have trouble growing things big. They can grow a tiny liver, like the size of a quarter, but they can't grow anything large. And so they're having essentially what they call scaffolding problems. A scaffold is a kind of a loose structure that they grow biological tissue over. And so instantly we realized that if we could start growing buildings, we're essentially growing cheap, deployable, organic scaffolds that are self-replicating. And if we can do that, it'll solve the liver people problems, at the same time. And that's what got me very excited about it.
So what do you think the trajectory of that is in terms of time between now and realizing that? Like any sense what that looks like right now?
No, but after the TED Talk came out, I got emails from people all over the country that were saying, I was just diagnosed with liver cancer. When can I get a new liver?
Oh,
and
dear.
I'm like, oh, crap. The timeline is interesting. It could be as short as 5 years. It could be as much as 20. The other part of, if we're starting to grow buildings using this new type of synthetic biology, manipulating DNA to grow even a table or a wall, it would start to get the general public accustomed to that technology. And so the ick factor diminishes. If I tell you I'm going to grow a liver and put it in your chest, you might be freaked out by it. But if you spend a few years living with a table that grew, like, how we grew that table, we're going to do that for your liver. Maybe, the ick factor goes away. So what I've discovered is a lot of human progress is not dependent on our technical ability, but our ability to stomach and accept these differences.
Mm-hmm. So you and I are both passionate about making a difference in the challenges we face with respect to climate change, environmental harm. And those kind of solutions are running on a track that may be slower than some of the challenges we face. So what do you see that we should be doing in the interim to address those challenges? If not living, like the living thing, the table may take 5 years to get. We've got huge problems that are here today. Like, is there an intermediate step of solutions that you would be thinking are important as well?
Yeah, I something changed inside me in the last 5 years where I've run out of patience. I think also doing it for so long, 25 years of I want everybody to agree, and I want them all to feel good about their decision to have a green building and blah, blah, blah. I'm over that. I'm way done with that. I don't give a crap. I'm going to force you to do this now. Every building needs to be net zero energy building. Every building needs to grow a portion of its own food or something. Every building needs to process water in a new way. Right. Every building needs to only use healthy materials. And doing those things is hard, as you know. Yeah. But it's not impossible. It's doable. And that's what initially drew me to Living Building Challenge. Here was an organization that was saying, here's where the bar needs to be. And that bar doesn't change. Every building needs to generate its own energy, process its own waste, clean its own water, avoid all known cancer-causing chemicals. That's the bar. It wasn't LEED, as much as I like LEED. It wasn't trying to be, let's make everybody happy and let's do it incrementally so you feel good about it.
Let's make it less bad.
Yeah, the less bad approach.
Yeah. As opposed to, no, it's got to be okay, at least.
Yeah, and the first slide of every...
First, do no harm.
Yeah, the first slide of every Living Future slide deck is the chart of what we don't want to be less bad. We want to be good. So that's what drew me to that, and also the idea of having a greater impact in a shorter period of time. I'm an old white guy now, so I'm like a dinosaur. My extinction is inevitable. So how can I have as much impact as possible in the shortest amount of time? And so making people be less bad is not the way to do it.
And what about wood? Where does wood fit in? Because I recall, and I think it was the first TED Talk you did, or maybe both of them, you showed a wood frame house from the 1800s and then one from contemporary, and you said they're both the same. But at the same time, I thought, yeah, but they're both made of wood. And if it were sustainably harvested, wouldn't that actually, entrain carbon, lock it up, and improve the ecosystem of the forest? Like, that's actually sort of a living building concept, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing how people react to those pictures, because I'll show a building from, I think 1816, and then I show one from 2016.
200 years ago.
And it's the exact same technology. We're building out of little sticks of wood, and certainly balloon framing and platform framing date back that long. And it benefits because it's a very ubiquitous technology. Everybody on the job site knows how to frame a wall that way. I mean, even an Amish person knows how to frame a wall, and they don't even have TV. So that's part of what it's got going for it is the ubiquity, but it's also locking us into this old technology.
So it's not the wood that's the issue. It's the technique of using that wood.
No, it could be just as easily be metal studs, or it could be made of rice cake studs. It doesn't matter to me. The idea of doing balloon framing or platform framing, think where else in your life are you regularly using a 200-year-old technology? Did you ride your horse and buggy to work today?
No, but so much of architecture is like old technology.
Exactly. That's nuts to me. And so I want to change that. I built a lot of buildings where we did wood framing, but instead of, I know you're Canadian, but I'm going to use inches. Instead of 16,
that's okay. We had inches. We're bilingual. We could do inches. We understand it.
But instead of 16 inches on center, we do 24 inches on center.
Yeah.
And so I'm stripping out already a third of the wood out of the building, and then I can use that savings to essentially buy sustainably harvested wood or FSC certified wood. So I did a lot of those budget juggling tricks. I think what we need is a solution that's scalable. And so what excites me is something like the cross-laminated timber, tall timber wave that you're seeing. Yeah. We're seeing it along the West Coast. I don't know about here in Toronto, but...
Yes, mass timber here.
But the mass timber to me is exciting. It's a renewable resource. We can grow more of it. We're not importing it from anywhere.
It meshes nicely with the zero carbon.
Absolutely. And you can...
Right? And you tie up carbon and sequester more carbon.
Yeah, so much better than steel in terms of embodied energy, much better in sequestering. And the other thing is when you're done with that building, you could conceivably take it apart and reuse it somewhere else.
Yeah,
I love the idea of it.
Well, what do you think architects in general should be doing over the next 10 years to have the most positive impact on reducing harm and adapting to climate change?
They need to go to a store and buy what's called a backbone and start and install it somewhere in their spinal region. Architects are maybe because
say they get the backbone and they get a good version that works and doesn't hurt too much. What kind of things should they be doing?
They need to be pushing the conversation. Yeah. We've relinquished way too much authority and responsibility and duty to contractors because of liability, and because of that, we've essentially eliminated ourselves from any sort of meaningful conversation. So the irony is, at a time when we need architects and that level of problem solving more than ever, we've made ourselves almost irrelevant to the conversation. For most buildings are not designed by architects now, and that's a problem that's evident. I think especially in the cities in the U.S., it's a real issue. So I think what we need to do is we need to be pushing more, and it's not like I'm unwilling to do this. Every client I meet, it's they're not coming in saying, "Please give me a net zero energy building." They're saying something stupid like, "Oh, well, I'd like an office, please." And then I go, "Great, we're going to make it net zero and it's going to save you money, and here's how." So I'm the one pushing them. It's not that I'm so lucky. I mean, I do have nice clients, but it's not that I'm so lucky that these clients are demanding this stuff. They mostly just want their office or their hotel or whatever it is they're after.
So it really does come down to guts.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how many architects I meet all over North America because I lecture all over, and they go, we're ready. As soon as a client comes in and asks for these things, we're totally ready. We have, we got two 23-year-olds on staff that got their lead AP.
They can do it. We don't know what it is, but they can do it.
Yeah, they'll just do it.
God.
It's like, no, it's you gotta get samples and have it in your library and have it everywhere. You got to talk about it openly with the client, and you really have to grow yourself a little bit of a backbone and take a leadership position here. And I think if we can do that, we could find our relevance again.
What about what's missing? What's missing from the discussion of climate change in our field and in amongst our clients? Like, are there any questions that we should be asking that we're not?
Well, yeah. The main one is really about financing or how we're paying for this stuff. Most of the emphasis tends to be on upfront cost or construction cost. And, even something like solar panels, we might be calculating the payback, and that's helping the client make their decision. But at the end of the day, they still need to produce a certain amount of money to get in the building.
Right.
But it's that viewpoint of scarcity of, I only have this much, I have X amount of money to spend, and that's all I can spend on the project. I can't spend a penny more. And they're coming from an approach of scarcity when they do have a lot of things that are in abundance that they're ignoring. So changing the financing is important, but as architects, we don't finance buildings. Like we point to bankers and lenders, and they do that. So I'd like to see
a more coherent understanding of the finance of both long-term and short-term.
Yeah, I mean, what financial sense does it make, to build a building cheaply that's going to cost you a ton to operate?
Right. Yeah.
And so there have been things like energy efficient mortgages and other little financial tools like that, but they tend to be all small scale. I'd love to see large scale financing opportunities where by making an investment in a building that doesn't cost a lot to operate or improves the quality of life for the occupants, that there's a payback. And most of those things are externalized. But imagine if, we're in a green office right now. Imagine if your health insurance for your employees was discounted because you used healthy finishes. That'd be an easy thing to do.
And a motivator, and it wouldn't have to be stipulated by the government. Right,
and the health insurance company likes it, and the materials manufacturers suddenly like it, and then the architects like it, and the occupants certainly like it. We need new financial tools like that. That's what's needed. Everything else, I can find you a countertop that's made of recycled dungarees and doesn't off gas. That's not the easy part.
So, Eric, what do you think we need to do more than anything else to meet the challenges of the 21st century imperative? That is, how can we best reduce harm, adapt to climate change, and repair and regenerate the damage we've already done? Is there any, Pareto 20-80 relationships? We only have so much time, so much resource. What should we do if we're going to focus?
So all the scientists that I talk to, the real climate scientists, they all agree that we're trying to land between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade in terms of global temperature change. If we stay where we are, we're going to go all the way to 4. And when I say these things to general audiences, their eyes glaze over. They don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Yeah. But so I have a great analogy for how I explain it to audiences. I go, look, I know you don't understand 1 degree, 1.5, 2 degrees centigrade, whatever. I don't either. Here's what it's like. We're totally screwed no matter what. Our world is changed already. It's changing and will continue to change. It's like how severe. It's a little more bearable at 1.5 than at 2. And to get to 1.5 means that we still have to take pretty drastic steps. It's all bad news. But if we can understand that, I think the better off we'll be.
And what kind of things do we have to do? The biggest moves we could make that would have the most impact?
Well, there's a lot of them. We need to monetize carbon. That would be the biggest move of all. And everybody's been talking about that forever, but not really doing it.
What's actually happening right now in California, Ontario, Quebec,
and China,
and China, although that's a closed economy, so they can do anything they want. But here it's had huge impacts. Like my clients in higher education, university and colleges, have never before now cared that much about whether or not I could do a zero carbon building for them. They said, well, if you can do it and it doesn't impact the budget, sure, that sounds great, bonus. But now it's like, oh my goodness, we're going to have to pay X number of thousands of dollars in this cap and trade. Well, tell us exactly how we're going to do that, please. So it's certainly changed the landscape significantly.
California also has, they have a host of almost chess-like maneuvers that they set up over the last decade. They have one called Senate Bill 375, which essentially incentivizes developers to place housing in walkable areas. So you wouldn't have to get in a car at all. You could essentially just walk outside and work or shop or do whatever you need to do. So, we really have to rethink all of our carbon assumptions. And the trouble is that it all involves change, and most people are fearful of change, even when the change would be a better quality of life.
By the way, I think the fear of change is one of the reasons a lot of architects now don't have that backbone. It's not that they don't have a backbone. They're just afraid of learning what's required in order to be able to do it, right? It's new. Like, this is not what we've done for the last 20 years. How do we do this?
Yeah, but
and looking stupid in front of their clients. Not being experts.
A lot of them know it already. They've forgotten it, if anything. Remember all those great passive houses in the 70s that were.
Yeah, but you and I were looking at that stuff, and our classmates were looking at whether or not it was proportioned or the theory was right, whatever. So what do you think is the best way to drive large-scale change and large-scale action, the kind needed to move us in the right direction in solving climate change? I know you're not a politician, you're an architect, but you do, part of your shtick is to try and motivate people to do the right thing, right?
Well, I think I start to sound like a bit of a socialist then if you're asking what we should do.
That's okay in Canada, actually.
We can't. Yeah, it's fine here. We can't wait for people to want to do it. We can't hope that we educate them enough that they volunteer to do it. We have to, in a certain sense, force them to do it for the greater good. Last year, we in the U.S. we had 3 hurricanes within a 3-week period that were record-breaking. One record-breaking for wind speed, one for land speed, and one for water. And the poor people in Puerto Rico are still suffering months later. And we just entered hurricane season again. So what happens when this is occurring every year? Eventually, the costs are going to be so unbearable in dealing with these climate catastrophes that we won't be able to afford to do business as usual anyway. So a certain part of me is thinking the capitalism is going to solve this itself. The United States, I don't know about Canada because nobody cares about Canada. But that's a joke. That's a joke.
Certainly
folks.
not the current administration.
No. But the U.S. spent $306 billion last year dealing with climate-related disasters. That is a lot of money, and frankly, money that we can't afford. And so, eventually, the cost of dealing with the aftermath is going to get so unbearable that we're going to have to take a much more proactive approach. Yeah. And so, I think I'm just waiting for that.
Vested interest will start to scream.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We face some pretty serious climate change challenges over the next 25 years. What scares you the most about the climate change challenges we now face?
Food. I think food is something I realized I don't know enough about. I've been learning, but as an architect, I can't really affect food that much in terms of how it's done on a scale. But the numbers are really upsetting in terms of how we grow it, how we ship it, how we transport it, how we dispose of it. And, I think if I were a young person looking at where I could have the most impact in sustainability, I would probably focus on food rather than buildings right now, because we certainly need it. We have a history of having a resource problem in the industrialized nations.
Yeah.
People are going hungry when we're fatter and fatter. So it's really about resource manipulation. But climate change
and equitable distribution.
Yeah, climate change is just going to exacerbate all of food production. And California, that's a big economic driver for them. And so they're
running out of water.
They've understood that.
It's getting
running
hotter.
Out of water.
Yeah.
It's very labor intensive. It's very water intensive. It's very chemical intensive, and it doesn't need to be. And so I've been just fascinated with this idea of what we could do in terms of addressing growing food for lots of people in a short period of time.
Are you optimistic that we have any chance of meeting the needs of people's food requirements or food supply going forward?
I'm optimistic because if not, I'd be at home, rocking in the fetal position. So I'm optimistic just to get through the day, but I'm also very much a realist and one who studies history. And I know for a fact that things are going to have to get a lot worse before it drives us to take action and do something about it. So, Winston Churchill has a great quote, and he says, I always count on Americans to do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every other possible option. And I think that's true. So I things are going to get worse. We're going to try a lot of stupid stuff and waste a lot of time and money, and then eventually we'll come around and go, oh, I guess we'll just do what the hippies have been telling us to do for decades.
What gives you hope when things are looking really dark?
What gives me hope is that evolution in thinking is not a slow, gradual pace. Evolution is in fits and starts. Think about some of our social issues like gay marriage, how it seemed at its darkest days, it'll never be allowed, it'll never be accepted. And I think within 8 years in the U.S., suddenly it's kind of the law of the land. And so I started tracking these kind of movements in social history, racial segregation. What was the one with alcohol? Prohibition.
Smoking.
And so it's amazing how suddenly it'll almost switch to, oh, I hate this. It's okay. And just deal with it. And so a lot of it is waiting for people just to accept something that you can already see as logical. And so that gives me hope, but also makes me realize that, at this point in our human history, talking about carbon, talking about fossil fuels, talking about climate change is it's boring, it's depressing, blah, blah, blah. But eventually it'll just be part of the conversation the same way we talk about interest rates or ROI or, or project schedules. It'll just be something built into our process.
And I see it happening with our younger staff at Dialogue. Anyone between the ages of about 20 and 30, it's just part of the conversation. It's an expectation that we're going to have to figure out how to do this.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's all been dumped on them. So
Well, they've got to pick up the pieces after the boomers left them the world.
Exactly.
So changing gears a bit, I have a few favorite questions I like to ask all my guests at the end of the interview. So first question, what books related to these issues do you most often recommend or gift to other people?
Oh, gosh. So there's a set of books that I buy stacks of and I hand them out. And so I'll tell you all of them. One is a book called Dark Age Ahead by Jane Jacobs.
Yes. Yeah.
It's amazing how she wrote it, because she wrote it almost like a play. It's done in this narrative, but they're talking about very technical economic issues around climate change. So it's just a great book in that regard and an easy read. And
she's so readable too.
Yeah,
exactly. She has an amazing ability to make complex things simple to understand.
I used to hand out Natural Capitalism to people by Paul Hawken.
Yes.
And then Hawken is so smart that he came out with a better book called Project Drawdown.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is so intelligently researched. So that one's just been interesting. It's not a fun, happy book, but it's an interesting book. I still tell people to read Cradle to Cradle by McDonough. Yeah. Just because I've seen the effect it has on people when they read it. It makes them look at the world in a new way. It's paradigm shifting.
Yeah. Every single new person at Dialogue gets one when they sign on.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Fantastic.
What other one? And then the last book that I give to everybody, I give to my students too, is it's a children's book, and it's called Harold and the Purple Crayon.
What's that about?
It's a tiny little children's book that you read when you were 5.
I don't remember reading that one.
It's about a kid in his pajamas who his mom gives him a purple crayon, and he fantasizes whole beautiful new worlds to play in. And so it's kind of the reason why we do this, is that we're creative problem solvers, we're world builders, and the book is a nice easy reminder to never let that fun part of it escape you.
And second question, what key things would you teach a grade 9 class to help them better understand how to create a more sustainable, regenerative world?
Well, I've done this. I realize that with 9th graders, because they're a mess of hormones and zits and weird facial hair, that you can't really you're not going to teach them technical, regenerative, resilient stuff. So what I do is I walk them through a life cycle assessment. And so I just point to stuff in the classroom. I go, what's this table made out of? And some kid will go, wood. And I'll go, right, wood. Where does wood come from? And some smart ass will go, oh, Lowe's or Home Depot. Go, yeah, but where did they get it from? Trees. Yeah, trees. And and so I walk them through this kind of very participatory thing of life cycle. And we'll do wood, we'll do glass, we'll do metal. And then they start to not know the answers to these things, which is telling. And the implication being that you should know the answers to these things. And then I say, what's this carpet made of? And they go, well, we don't know. I said, what if I told you the carpet was made of thousands of chemicals? And most of those chemicals are cancer-causing. How would you feel about it?
Everyone lifts their feet off the ground at that point.
So we go through this. I'm trying to teach them how to fish. I'm trying to kind of give them the tools of asking the questions. Where does this come from? What were the byproducts of making this? What are you going to do with it when you're done with it? How healthy is it? Can we use it again? Those just offering them that information more than anything, because they'll walk away and they'll remember that. And because it's a fun exercise that we do, it's surprisingly effective.
Yeah. And as you said, very memorable. Okay. Third question. If you could publish a full page spread in the Sunday New York Times of anything you wanted, written or graphic or combination, what would you do with it?
Well, right now I'm preoccupied with Trump, but putting it in the New York Times isn't going to change anything.
And it will get lost.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
The biggest tragedy of this whole Trump thing, regardless of your politics, is that it's completely hijacked our entire national conversation away from anything else.
Yeah.
And so even when real issues do come up, such as Puerto Rico, there's no oxygen in the room to talk about them. And climate change is certainly didn't even make it into the presidential debates with Trump and Hillary, and certainly hasn't been discussed since. Even when he pulled out of Paris, the implications of that weren't discussed as much as, what a jerk, he doesn't,
Right.
And so that's the trouble. So if anything, I'd almost like to find a way to turn people's chin to look at something much bigger than Trump. But, it would also have to be very actionable. Direct them to a website or direct them something where they could commit to something that they would tangibly do. So that's a tough one. It also wouldn't be enough. I mean, I almost feel like my country's fundamentally broken, and we're going to need a whole bunch of therapy after whatever this period is in order to move forward.
So maybe half the page is the books that we just talked about. The next half is a good set of therapists.
Yeah, or a group hug.
Group hug. And to wrap up, what advice would you offer our listeners about what they can do to be part of making a difference in meeting the challenges of 21st century imperative?
I think this can all seem very overwhelming. I think given the spectrum of problems that we have, energy, water, food, carbon, temperature, drought, ocean acidification, if you're feeling overwhelmed, my advice to you is just start. Just start doing something. I can't wait for you to feel like you're an expert. I can't wait for you to feel comfortable. I can't wait for you to feel like you know enough. We're way out of time for that. I need you to just start, knowing that you'll make missteps along the way, knowing that you'll form new opinions and evolve along the way. That's fine. That's the way it works. But just start. And so if it helps, just pick one issue that really bothers you, whatever it is, and find a way to talk about that issue in a way that'll make people remember it. I use humor for that, right? That's because that's what I know. But for other people, it's look at there's an organization called Charity Water that does this really well with water. They're able to talk about water in a way that's memorable. So find a way to make it memorable, find a way to make it actionable, and find a way to direct people's anger and frustration into something good that they can do to change it. And then advocate like hell for that thing. And so if it's refugees' rights, then focus on that and just become the refugee person. If it's on clean water, then just become the clean water person. If it's on, using fly ash and concrete, if that's the thing that really bothers you, then just become the fly ash person. Right. That's what we need. We need people to stand up and become leaders in this, not experts, but true leaders, getting people to change the way we do things.
You don't have to do everything. Pick something and become a leader.
Exactly.
I think that's a great place to end off. Thanks very much. Really appreciate your time. It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. You can find links to more information about Eric Corey-Fried and to notes about what we discussed in this podcast at tfcipodcast.com. And if you like this podcast, please let us know by rating it on the Apple iTunes podcast website. Until next time, thanks for listening.